So recently I've been learning a little bit about the Australian military. I've learned specifically about their exploits in World War II, and I'm going to be doing that again today. This one is common myths about the Australian Army in World War II, casual historians believe. So I don't really know any myths, so this is not just, I guess, sometimes when you watch videos like this, it's like dispelling or confirming myths. This one for me, I'm just going to be learning more about the Australian Army in World War II. Tell me if you've heard of any of these myths before. If there's any other interesting video about Australia at that time in World War II or any other conflicts, recommend those videos as well.
We tell stories because we'd often prefer to live in fiction than face the horrors of reality. Myths are a type of story, and we often use them to make sense of what we can't make sense of or what we refuse to. Myths can protect us from the truth. As war is so horrific, it makes sense why we would dress it in myth. Falsehoods and exaggeration shroud both world wars, and no belligerent nation is totally free of them, not even Australia. In this video, we're going to shed light on some of the myths commonly associated with Australians in the First and Second World Wars. One prevailing myth regarding Aussies in world wars is that they were, by and large, rugged, resourceful bushmen with exceptional tans. According to Michael John Pine's relationships between officers and other ranks in the Australian Army in the Second World War, this was a stereotype proliferated by the famous Aussie historian Charles Bean. In reality though, the majority of Australian men who served in wars came from the city and urban backgrounds. They were city slickers. As the bushman stereotype was so prominent in stories from World War I, Aussie soldiers sent off to fight in the Second World War felt they had to live up to it, when, really, the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. According to Pine, many of these men were living in the shadow of the Australian bush and pioneer legends, which helped to form the identity of the Australians in World War I.
Yeah, tell me if you know it, if you've heard about that. A bushman, is that, I'm going to guess the way they made the difference there is someone from like more rural areas, like the outback. Said obviously the majority were actually just city folk. So yeah, interesting even how like that reputation from the First World War came to be, like trying to build it up to be this thing. I guess that's from the media or, as I said, historians. Like, why would they do that, do you think? Why would they try and create this this reputation? Is it to make it sound more fearsome, or what effect would it have? Like, it just seems like defining people incorrectly. Like, but yeah, I guess everybody who fought deserves respect, whether they're from rural areas or the city.
Another aspect of Aussie soldiers that appears to have been blown out of proportion was their larrikinism. This term isn't super easy to pin down, but we define a larrikin as a troublemaker with a good heart. In a military context, the negative effects of larrikinism boiled down to a perceived lack of discipline. But were the Aussies truly lacking in this department? With this, it's very much the extent to which Australian soldiers lack discipline that is the myth, as there are, if we're being honest, bucket loads of examples of poor discipline to draw upon, especially from the First World War. For instance, the aforementioned historian Bean wrote the following in his diary. There was a great deal of drunkenness in Cairo, and I could not help noticing that what people said was true. The Australians were responsible for most of it. I think we have to admit that our force contains more bad hats than the others, and I think also that the average Australian is certainly a harder liver. He does do bad things, at least that the rest of the world considers as really bad. Here, Bean was agreeing with British General Sir Archibald Murray, who, reflecting on Australian soldiers' behaviour in Cairo, said, "I have never seen a body of men in uniform with less idea of discipline." So, that settles it, right? The Aussie diggers were just as undisciplined and uncontrollable as their reputation suggests. Well, maybe not. There's plenty of evidence of good discipline too, including what Bean wrote for the Australian War Memorial in 1983. It was discipline, firmly based on the national habit of facing facts and going straight for the objective, that was responsible for the Australians' astonishing success. This definitely contradicts what he wrote about the Aussies in Cairo, and while we chalk it up to Bean wanting to paint Australian soldiers in a more positive light later in life, Others have made similar arguments, especially in the context of World War II. Hearing stories of Anzac larrikinism and mateship from their fathers and grandfathers who served in the First World War, the soldiers of World War II believed they would, in Pine's words, be led by an informal discipline rather than a formal military discipline. But this led to a sense of disappointment and bitterness when they did not find that the army lived up to these expectations. Instead of officers and men pulling together in the spirit of the Anzac legend, they found an army that was led by an officer class that was more elite than they had expected. When Pine said informal discipline, he was referring to a system dictated by mateship and mutual respect. A quote by World War I veteran Rog Burridge illustrates this point. "We had good officers. We respected them. They were down-to-earth blokes, and just like mates. They treated us the same as themselves. They respected us and we respected them. They all were working class people, so they were okay." So, while the Aussies may have lacked discipline in a traditional military sense, they weren't wholly without it. They just had their own brand of it.
Yeah, because that's what I've heard in the videos I watched previously, is like the Australian military were one of the most, I mean the word here feared, one of the most feared and respected. We've seen what Rommel had to say about the Australian soldiers, how they were the most fearsome, the most, they getting the best results basically. So it's like, whether they had that like traditional discipline or not, they still got results of what they had to in war. And like, I think like that, a time they talk about the drinking and this and that, I guess like that happens to any military. The British soldiers, I'm going to guess, would be similar personalities, similar drinking, if you want to look at it purely from that. And it's like a time of war. A lot of these guys got called up without having a choice, with whether it was like conscription and that sort of thing. It's like a completely alien situation to go into. Like, you like would imagine they would have to blow off steam, and it's like not their life really. So it's like, to get that discipline would be quite difficult. I guess again, not just Australians, but for any military at that time. And this word, yeah, interesting to learn, because I've seen that word larrikin before. I guess that's just a very purely Australian thing, but we have like similar words and similar people in the UK as well. So is that still a word that gets used? And tell me more about Bean, what you think about him. Like, it's like that one person, historian, documenting that, and but having so much effect on the narrative and the perception and reputation of these soldiers. You think that's a good thing or not?
If larrikinism was one side of a coin, fearlessness was the other. If we're to believe the stereotype, while the Aussie soldier may have lacked typical military discipline, his morale was always high and he feared nothing. Of course, this was far from true for every soldier. In Anzac Memories, putting popular memory theory into practice in Australia, author Alistair Thompson states, "The legend of the Australian soldier, the best fighter in the war, caused many diggers to repress their feelings during and after the war." Thompson goes on to quote Great War veteran Fred Farrell, who spoke of the trauma he suffered after returning home. "I had dreams of being shelled and being frightened, scared stiff. You don't know when the next shell that is coming is going to blow you to pieces or leave you crippled." Yeah. Farrell also explained that the digger stereotype, the larrikin and fearless fighter, did not fit his experience of the war, and also made him feel uncomfortable about his own identity. For this reason, he avoided Anzac celebrations like the plague. In his book We Were the Rats, Australian World War II veteran Jack Lawson Glassop suggests that Anzac legends from the First World War caused similar problems for Australians in World War II. In Glassop's words, "The trouble is the world expects so much of us. They think we all swear like troopers, drink like fish, and fight like wildcats, and that we don't know the meaning of the word fear. We can blame our fathers. It makes it hard for us. All our lives, we've read that when our turn comes, we don't let everyone down." So, while these expectations may have rallied the Aussies as a collective, the individual soldier was still shaking in his boots.
A lot of pressure.
Returning to our definition of a larrikin, a troublemaker with a good heart, we can shed some light on another myth regarding Australian soldiers, that they were all, indeed, and always good-hearted people. Our point here is that Australian soldiers committed atrocities too. For one, they were not above killing surrendered Japanese in the Second World War, a notion supported by Australian historian Mark Johnston. In his words, it often proved difficult to prevent Australian soldiers from killing captured Japanese before they could be interrogated. Some Japanese soldiers were almost certainly deterred from surrendering to Australians. If General Sir Thomas Blamey is anything to go off, this behaviour was far from shunned by High Command as well. In January 1943, interviewed by the New York Times, he said, "We are not dealing with humans as we know them. Our troops have the right view of the Japs. They regard them as vermin."
Yeah, I'll continue on, but I just wanted to say something about this as well, because actually I watched a video recently where Canadians had a similar reputation as well about killing captured prisoners of war and that sort of thing. But it's like, it wasn't just Australia and Canada doing these things, it was every country was doing it, British, American. It's like, to paint one country or the troops of one country is bad because of this sort of thing, I think is unfair, because whether that happens probably in every conflict, I would imagine. And the thing is, it's talking about, with regards to Canada, it was talking about the Germans, with this it's talking about the Japanese. What the Japanese and Germans were doing at this time to ordinary civilians, and this is talking about this, Australians weren't killing ordinary civilians, this is soldiers they were doing it to. What the Japanese and Germans were doing to civilians and other soldiers at the time was more horrific than anything else you could can imagine. Being from Malaysia, I know what the Japanese did here when they invaded here. Lots of utterly disgusting and terrible things. And at this time, these soldiers are just trying to stop them. It's a war, like, they're trying to kill them, trying to stop them from committing these atrocities. Like, you can see why this sort of thing would go on. I think it's like, maybe to some people it's hard to understand looking back at it in the past, but for me, I can understand it when you hear, the things they were
As
doing.
for an example from World War I, there was a case of the Kiwi soldier, Leslie Lowry, who chased after a Bedouin man who'd robbed him near the village of Sarafend Alamar in what was then, in 1918, Palestine. Closing on the thief shot him, and with his dying words, Lowry told his Anzac brothers in arms what had happened. The Anzacs then took their revenge, an event which the famous Australian poet Banjo Patterson described like this. "A few Australians went along with them. There couldn't be any trouble on any front without an Australian being in on it. And the revenge party followed the thief to his village, recovered the stolen goods, and killed every able-bodied man in the village. Then they threw the bodies down the well, filled the well up, and burnt the village. This wasn't troublemaking, this was an atrocity." So going off the evidence we discussed today, not all Australian soldiers were rugged bushmen, not all of them were undisciplined larrikins, not all of them were fearless, and not all of them were always good blokes. But what do you think? Do you agree that the myths we covered are actually myths? Do you have any evidence that reinforces or contests our arguments?
Yeah, that's the thing with these, I guess they are myths. So yeah, like, I've got to say, a very well put together mini documentary again. Like, tell me what you think about them, if you have any deeper knowledge. I know when I'm reading the comments of the previous videos, there's a lot of people with a lot of good information, a lot of knowledge of the Australian military in World War II specifically as well. So I'd love to hear what you know, what you think about these, and yeah, if you've got any other good subjects about the Australian military, please recommend the videos for that as well. Thanks.